Okay, we're good.
All right, welcome to our special city council meeting for August 16th, 2021. First item is 2.1, Herriman City Strategic Plan and Vision Discussion. Nathan.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us on another Monday night here. I wanted to give a quick rundown through a model that Alan and I and Tammy have been working on. It is not done, so this is not the one he's working on. This is one I saved from his and made some changes on, but I just want to show you how it works and tell you where we're at, and then we can talk specifically why we're putting that together as it relates to these other items. So typically, there's a list of assumptions we go through. We're still talking about this. He did add a section here where the police want to add officers. What would that look like? So you put in your assumptions. You have capital assumptions. What are you spending money on? A lot of this, we only have data really in these first 3 years. If you look at this, ignore that. That's just me putting stuff in there. If we could spend this much on streets, what would it look like? There are some other nuances, but you put this together. We're working on a 5-year CIP. It's which is a capital improvement plan. It's helpful so that we know when things are coming. If we were to make an agreement with another agency to help put in a road, say, we could put it in this plan, we would know that was coming, it wouldn't come as a surprise in the future. I'm not saying anything else about that. It's maybe too soon to talk about that, but, so that's what this would do. There's, all your data's in there. What you end up with, it starts to put into, what you anticipate in your revenues, on its chart. Of course, then your expenditures by each of your divisions, you go through there. And then you have a chart. The chart then allows you to see where you project your fund balance to be. And if you were then to go through here and say, we're going to add, who's going to get lucky today?
I'm so glad that's not done.
We'll add somebody in economic development. So we're just going to guess what that would be. You would do this a little bit more officially if we were doing it, but. So just guessing. Then you could come back out here and say, if we did that, what does it do to the chart? Okay, well, it starts to pull. So as you as council are hearing decisions, you can look at that. And again, ignore this chart. It's not correct, but we're working on it still. We also have one public safety, which this doesn't include some of the other things we're talking about right now.
Oh, just
but it does include the,
the door.
it includes about half of the growth they were asking for, and that's about $1.7 million in the out years. So to keep them from the general fund, to keep them level. So we'll have to talk about that. But so this is just a model. The intent of the model is to help illustrate the impacts when you're making decisions. And it's finance and I will be using this, but council can use it when they're asking that question, can we afford this? We can put it in here and say, this is what we think. Again, it's based off of assumptions. There's a lot that can be argued about the assumptions, and Alan and I have been talking about what some of those are and how you put those together. And he actually has gone through and added charts for all of your different funds, all the different funds we have, including our impact fees. We can kind of track, if we're gonna spend this, do we have it, how are we collecting it? So more of this will be coming as we finalize and push through. We're trying to link them, because if you move money from one, it should flow through. So that's still a work in progress.
What timeline do you think would be the turnaround on this report?
Oh, I was hoping to have it done already, but couple weeks, 3 weeks maybe. Alan's gone this week, so.
So my only feedback on that is I know that historically from a finance view, we've taken very conservative estimates, which I'm fine with. What I wanna make sure is that we don't go so conservative that we start to miss opportunities because we're just holding money. So I'm not the financial expert, but I wanna make sure that we don't use overly conservative numbers that put us in a position where we're not making decisions that we could have had we made a more realistic expectation. And I don't know if we are or not, I just know that we tend to be very conservative.
Yeah, and I think it's often easier to come in and say, hey, we got more revenue than we anticipate as opposed to we got less. So in those out years, those, they are assumptions, right? So you build them in there when you look at this and say, okay, we anticipate this might happen or that. But you do have this blue line right there that's up at the top is a 35% fund balance. And I think that's what the state says your max can be. You can argue back and forth whether that's an appropriate number or if that's too high. I think 5%'s the minimum, 35%'s the max. At some point, when you get really, really high fund balances, your citizens should be asking, what are you doing with the money we're sending you? You're just holding it, you're not spending. Now, sometimes those will move, you're gonna build a big street, and so you save it for a bit and then you spend it, but this really, what you don't wanna see is
Slush fund.
the ski slope, right? So you've agreed to things that are sending you into the negative.
Quickly.
And so that's one of the keys is what is your trajectory? With the fund balance, you have to be careful of the slush fund argument. 35% I think is pretty high. 25% is usually more industry standard.
So
Some places are lower than that, some are higher, but.
So whatever the minimum is, like I like this chart, this is dumps it down for politicians, which is great. Like me. I love the maximum line. I would also appreciate a minimum line, so I actually know where that was.
The 5%? Yeah.
And then, I would also like to see what our, like, run a linear regression or something to show us what kind of our averages over time through regression. So that we kind of have an idea of where we've actually been trending with what we're getting.
So most of your estimates are built on either a 3 or 5 year rolling average, but you're gonna look at that. You should take into account inflation in those dollars, but that's how we, typically it's gonna be 3 to 5 years. That should give you enough time to catch highs and lows in the economy. Doing these analysis back in 2006 or 2010, when you were roaring and then you hit, you did see the 5 years kind of became where we wanted to do those. 3 was a little too short, but in some of our funds, we don't have a whole lot of history right now. Like our police and our public safety, we've only done it for 3 years, so we don't have much history to know. We can look at our own property taxes and see how those have played, but it's a little, it's just unique. And then with our growth, those are some things. So Alan and I are still working on that. Hopefully soon. Certainly, this will be part of our discussion as we move into the next budget with council, as you're thinking about, okay, where do we invest? How do we spend the resources we're being given by our citizens? This will play into that. So I just wanted to share a little bit where we were at. It is a work in progress. I think it's a little bit, it's valuable for staff over time and for council, but it just is taking a little bit of time to put it all together. We have a lot of money and it moves around a lot, so. With that, the reason I wanted to show you that is I'm hoping tonight to get some quick priorities from you that we can focus on. From a goals and strategy, or strategic planning, my recommendation is that you usually do those in January after an election, so that you have the longest continuity with a group. Your current vision statement, this was really confusing to me because we have a general plan that has a vision statement that's different. We have a new general plan that has a vision statement that's different. And this one, I was told, is the official one. This was in the budget. It's the one you've been using. So we should, as staff, we need to get our arms around that. And even though the consultants write beautiful things, we should say, hey, we have one of those. Yeah, that's more helpful that way. Otherwise, it gets
Triple vision is confusing.
You get confused. So this is our current vision. It sounds like it's been maybe since incorporation about the same. I don't know if anybody knows. So it's probably worth revisiting. Typically in a vision statement, you don't use the phrase continue because it's where you want to be, and you could drop that and this will still work. I found that interesting. Because a vision is where you want to be, a mission statement is what you're doing today to get there.
So just be Harriman will be a place to start. We'll just drop.
Yeah, everyone will be, because that's your vision, this is what you want, that's where you're shooting it. So this, if in '99 they were shooting this, we could have a step back and say, how did we do in 20 years, but,
Yeah.
it's just, we don't need to tackle this tonight, but I just wanted to share. Then you have 5 objectives, these show up in your budget. Fiscal responsibility, sustainability, the vibrancy, community engagement, planning for a viable future, level of service. I think I know so I pulled these out of the budget. What does it mean? I don't want to read all this to you, but these are in your budget. So we have these concepts. We're going to be fiscally responsible, public safety. We're starting to move into, and depending on which business school you go to, these are goals, these are objectives. I don't know, maybe if you pay a different tuition to a different professor, they teach you something different. Normally I'd call these goals and the things underneath objectives, but it's okay. I think these are the objectives and the ones underneath are the goals. Either way, we can make
Wishes.
all that work. Wishes, that too.
They're not goals or objectives, to be honest.
And so there's no measurability, which is why I would kind of,
Exactly.
they're not time limited. So these are what I would call, probably they're just more concepts. And what I mean by that, if you're going to support the attraction and retention of job centers, emergency, you would say something like, in the next 3 years, we intend to go for 3 of these, and then.
And this is how we're gonna do it. This is what we're gonna do to make that goal happen.
So, and this has been a frustration of mine for 20 years working with these. And so my last city, I convinced the council, after we adopted a strategic plan, which had all these cool high flying and some goals, they let us adopt a tactics plan. How do you get to that point? And that's where we really, then the budget had even more specific goals, again, based off of what we were seeing here, so. So my, quickly, after going through that, because this is really more about you all just, what are your top priorities? So as I said, the purpose of tonight is really just to come up with 1 to 3 priorities you want us to focus on. When we get into the budget next year, we'll need to have this conversation again. Because we need to, and there actually needs to be some strategic planning. The hard part with any goal is there's very few of them that you can accomplish in 3 months, 6 months, right? If it's fix the air conditioner so it's not so cold, that might be faster than recruit a Trader Joe's, right? That's gonna take effort and work, and it may not be immediate. So with that, I sent out some questions, hopefully just to spur some of your thinking about this, but I really would like you to think about what a successful Harriman looks like in your mind. And we may just put that aside, and when we do a strategic plan, you can be thinking about it that long. What does success look like? How do we know we've achieved it? Right? We have to have some goal. How do we get there? And then what investments? And investments are either resources, that's either money or staff time or political capital. What investments are we putting in to try and to accomplish something? And then also, are there things we're doing right now that don't add value or move us forward? So typically, I prefer to focus first on effectiveness and then efficiency. Because I'd hate to be incredibly efficient at something completely ineffective. So So as we talk through, that's kind of the mindset I'll be bringing to this. If you give me something, it may not be as fast, but we wanna make sure what we do moves the needle, makes a difference, and then we can figure out how to go all in and accomplish that, so.
So I have a comment. I was thinking about this when I was picking peaches. If we are a city that only picks the low hanging fruit and we just jump from new tree to new tree to new tree because we have lots of new fruit, we never ever maintain our orchard. And so those trees that could produce really well will eventually die, get diseased, and wither away, right? They just don't do well if all you focus on is low hanging fruit and you don't maintain what you have. And sometimes I feel like we spend a lot of time and effort chasing the next thing, chasing the next development, chasing the next one-time money, chasing those types of things because those are low-hanging fruit. They give us revenue, that keeps our city moving and pays for those O&Ms types of things. But what I think we need to do is I think we need to really focus on our city as it is right now, this very day, not any annexation, not any potential, not anything. We need to understand the needs of this orchard right now and make sure we're doing a really good job and making sure we're pruning it, or making sure we're taking care of everything that needs to be taken care of so there's longevity in it. Not just trying to fix the problems as we go, but really focus on taking good care of what we have. And then we bring in, and then we plant new trees. But if we don't take good care of what we have, we're always spinning our wheels, in my opinion, and we're just planting the next tree and we never grow anything substantial because we're never focused on maintaining what we have, and then we look for the additional additions to make it a stronger city. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. I've at least written down, and hopefully this is a conversation with council. I'm gonna be taking a bunch of notes, and maybe at the end, if we haven't come to an agreement, we'll synthesize it down and send it back out. What we think we've heard tonight. So I know Wendy's taking notes, Tammy's taking notes, so we'll all compare our notes afterwards. Theirs will probably be more legible than mine.
And it's never, I don't think it's ever ill intent by anyone, it's easy to pick low hanging fruit, it's just simply how it is. And, I just think sometimes, and I think it's responsibility of council to say, no, we have to rein it, we have to look at this and really do a good job of preserving what we have and making sure it's functioning well.
In regards to short-term focus, to the question I think you're asking, for me, the things that I think we need to focus on, because this is probably where I'm gonna spend most of my time thinking about, because my time is short here. Olympia, getting that process figured out one way or another. There's not necessarily a right answer if it comes in or it doesn't, but moving through that process. Second one for me is probably updating the design standards, so that as new projects come in, that they are to the standards that we are expecting. And probably the third is making sure that our MDA process is updated to the point that our boilerplate is what we want out of it. Those are probably the three things that I think would be the most important for us to get done in the next 6 months.
I just wanna make sure that I'm tracking where you would like to take this discussion in terms of, and I don't disagree with any of those items that the mayor just listed there. Is your goal in coming out of some of these priorities tonight to be that specific as far as some of the things we want, or are you talking a little bit more, I guess a little bit more broad goals that have a little bit wider, implication across the whole city, like roads or infrastructure? I mean, how narrow focused are you wanting us to be coming out of this tonight for you, in order for you guys to have some of the direction that you're hoping to get moving forward?
I think either work. If we keep it at that very specific, then those are tasks that you assign and you work through that may not, so good short term. if you went with, we want roads to be a priority, come back with a plan. We won't solve it tonight, but we'll take that and we'll figure out, okay, again, how do we deal with roads that exist today that are inadequate? Or either from deferred maintenance or maybe it's just more traffic than they were ever designed. How do we deal with the roads that are, already, we've already committed to build from growth, all right, we know we have to expand roads, those things, and then those that are truly new growth division. We could deal with something like that, so it's really up to council. How do you want us, again, something this specific? Great, we're working on the MDA process. We will come back with something that hopefully, at least this council will be happy with. I don't know about a next council, but we'll come up with a policy. So either way, whatever if there's been something that's been bugging you, hey, I wish we were doing, we'd love to hear that.
Because for me, I think the transportation component is one of the biggest things that we have right now to really focus on moving forward. And there's really a couple of different spokes of that one item, and you just mentioned most of them, Nathan. That is our current roads that are in, disrepair or are not, functioning to the level they're supposed to. Obviously 6,000 West and Herriman Main Street fall into that category. There's the component of the obligations that we have out there in terms of roads to be built for certain projects. We touched a little bit on that at the council meeting last week with the school. And then there's the more long-term, but needs to be started to be focused on now, the proactive planning approach of how are we going to make sure that we meet the demand in the future? I mean, some are gonna obviously argue that we're not meeting it now. There's some compounding factors to that right now, obviously, where, we don't have 126th as a east-west option right now. Starting to have that back in some fashion here, I guess, at the end of the month, still some limitations there. And then on the horizon, we have really that same process that's gonna happen at 134, so it's just gonna shift that compounding. So we've started to talk about entering into more robust discussions with UDOT in how do we really work with them on that future planning, that tie between Bangor and Mountain View corridor, the possibility of that, and then obviously everything that we know is on the docket that extends out west. And just when you talk about transportation, I mean, we can talk about just that one item all night long in here, but that's certainly not the only priority we have as a city, but I think it's one of the most pressing ones because it's one of the things that's felt the most currently by our residents.
I'm completely in agreement with transportation. That was one of the things I was gonna put on the long-term focus was transportation. To me, a lot of those transportation issues that we're working on right now are things that fall in place with Olympia anyways. And so that to me was one and the same, but I completely agree with Clint on that.
And obviously you could add a whole other spoke to that, what we just talked about, which is just the maintenance component of that, to making sure that our roads continue to perform and we're not spending those big dollars down the road because we're not spending the maintenance money up front. So there's a lot wrapped up into that. And I think as a council, understanding all of the commitments that are out there that we've tied into through various agreements and how that affects the other decision making of, if we bond and, how much money do we get, where can we divvy that, what reimbursements do we have coming off this project. There's just so many of those factors that tie in that I think there's been questions on our mind, and that will at least provide some clarity to help us make appropriate decisions on those moving forward.
Sorry, I'll let you guys keep going. I guess that was my part, like the orchard, it's like each of these is a different branch. Transportation is essential. Water, another essential thing. I think we did a good step in the right direction with our bond on the water. How do we make sure that we stay on top of that and ahead of that? Public safety, another one. We're talking about fire station, those kinds of things. Because to me, the proper role of government is just the critical things that we have to do. And the fluff is great and it's nice, but we have to make sure we have those priorities covered first before we worry about anything else. I know when we were in here with Alan, he presented us some figures before the budget came out and stuff, wanted to know what my personal priority is, and that's exactly what was said. Essential services, that is the priority, and that's what I think that we should be focusing on to keep the tree alive. We have to focus on the essential services. Power is another one. I know there's some building going on even in Bluffdale that Rocky Mountains have a hard time keeping up with. Where are we on that? Are we keeping ahead of the power that's necessary in our community? Do we know where we're at on that? Those types of things that we have to have to make our citizens continue to have quality of life. The other things are nice, but non-essential, and so in my mind, we have to focus on the essential before we worry so much about the non-essentials.
Can you, just so that I know what you're talking about, can you clarify the difference between what you feel is essential and non-essential services?
Sure, I pretty much listed them. Water, roads, public safety, power, things that make people be able to utilize their own gas, those type of infrastructure, true
So
infrastructure.
so the infrastructure, so things like, would you give me an example of non-essential things? What your mind of non-essential?
Oh, I don't know, some entertainments and things like that, they're not important, they're just not essential. They're great things that bring community together and provide value, provide quality of life, but they don't make it so that you don't have life. If you don't have water, you
No,
don't
it's
have
agreed.
life. So those kinds of things are super important. If you don't have good transportation, it's hard to get back and forth to work, therefore it's really hard to make your house payment and buy food. Those types of things are some of the things I think government, the proper role is those essential things. Parks are awesome, they're wonderful, they have a place where people can release that pressure if they're all cooped up and things like that, and they're important. But I just feel like we have to make sure these things are covered first, and then we figure out how to prioritize the other things that are important but not required for life.
It's fair, I'm trying to make sure I understood.
For sure.
Yeah.
Another thought I've had, I mean, for me, just the way I have to break it down in my own head to make sure I keep things straight, obviously there's the expense part of the cities and the things that we're trying to accomplish on the expense part and the funding part, and obviously there's many different buckets that encompasses over there. Sherry just mentioned them, we have public safety, we have a couple different buckets there and priorities that we have in those buckets. With public safety, we have our general fund, obviously, that encompasses a lot of that. We have water, it's separate, so there's all those things that fall under that. The other side of the expenses for me is the things that we've been trying to, or I think that we're focused on trying to do, and that's the commercial retail growth component of our city to help try and obviously reduce the burden, or at least provide for the funding mechanism on the other side. So obviously we've got a couple of projects that are moving forward, some that we're trying to continue to move forward, and I know that you've sent out a couple emails, Nathan, just in terms of consultants that we can use out there and those types of things, but that's a whole nother focus that I know that I think we've all had, and that is continuing to try and attract and get those, whether it's a job center or commercial retail, whatever it is out here that helps to support our sales tax base moving forward, to help make sure that we have funding in place moving forward. So, and I'm really looking forward to, again, having a little bit more of that discussion at some point with some of those ideas that you've sent out to us as well, based on your experiences.
Kind of the economic development, growth and all that.
Yep.
We good?
Unless you guys are, what I have is primary right now, I would say, what I distilled down, this is just me, but it's transportation, economic development, And then, I guess when I look at the design standards, is what is our image? But we have to maintain one-
100% Burgestone.
I kind of broke mine into the short term and long term. I mean, I agree with Sherry, going back to that conversation Alan brought us all on and told us the situation was dire, what's your focus? So what the focus needs to be on those critical services that only the city provides, right? So those same things that she named, water, roads, transportation, public safety, etc. So whether it's short term or long term, like that has to be the starting point, that's our focus, those basic services. And then kind of three things that I wrote down for like the 12 months that I personally would like to see, that I've had years wanting to see this. But I think we're in a position now, and I think we've seen that as we've gone through some of the recent monetary discussions, that we should not be using one-time money for operations at all. Right, we've discussed it a few times, we've kind of seen through some of those discussions that it's about $1 million, well, we could shave $1 million and still provide the same level of service than what we're doing now. Right? And that, and really, at least to me, the purpose of that one-time money is for capital projects. Right? That's part of why we're so far behind on maintaining the existing infrastructure, at least in my opinion, is we're, like Sherry said, chasing the low-hanging fruit with going after what new money, and ignoring the rest until we get to this situation we're in. So that's number one for me, short, the next 12 months. Two would be to know and quantify our obligations. How many times have we talked about that? This all goes into what you've talked about, Nathan, with having the strategic plan. We really haven't had one. It has just been year to year, more or less just taking care of what's right in front of us. And then kind of the third one for me goes along with everything else that's been said, but with the focus on the main point of we need a true maintenance plan for roads, parks, etc. And same thing, we just keep throwing money at it doing what we absolutely have to, and we need a better strategic plan. But what I mean by that is not just taking care of what's currently on the table, but planning for and budgeting for increases in that budget as we grow. We just have more and more needs, right? I think, at least in my 5.5 years, I've said this almost every year in budget discussion is, when I first started, it was $500,000 for road maintenance. And I think the first several years in a row, when all of our directors used to come, I would ask Monty every single year, so what should that be with our growth last year? And we've only increased it once in that time. So I think that should be a basic part of the budget every single year, is having that plan for not just roads, but parks and everything as we grow. How are we going to maintain those and keep that way? So to me, those are the three kind of short-term things that I'd like to see. And then what does a successful Harriman look like? To me, is a longer-term question. I think the answer to that for me is to be financially stable regardless of potential growth. We shouldn't be relying on future money to pay our current way. So I think this might be jumping ahead to what you have planned, but how do we get to success when this moves forward? Well, I think we have kind of a skeleton of all those things, but it's not a working plan. I mean, we need to balance land use. If we're just homes forever, right, that's never gonna work. We need to preserve the non-residential uses, right, commercial and employment centers. We can't just say commercial, because we need a true economic plan, right? And as I've tried to describe this before, it's not just about trying to get the commercial dollar. If you talk to a lot of those commercial establishments, we want a sit-down restaurant. Well, you need to have employment centers. They need a daytime population, right? Well, that employment center doesn't provide us with commercial retail sales tax. No, but it provides us with all the other taxes and brings people the other direction for traffic, right? It helps with public safety, and it supports that commercial. So we need all of those things. We need large recreation areas, whether it's the mountain, I know I'm a broken record with this, but we need true ingress and egress. Like, great, let's have some trails, but we don't have any real access, right, to bring people in from outside the city. And to me, that's how we win, at least with our unique position. We're not, I say this all the time, we're not on the way anywhere, right? The only reason you come to Harriman is if you live here, or if you know someone who lives here. We need some destinations to bring people here, whether it's employment, recreation, and to me, we have a great opportunity with the mountain, but if we fill everything in with homes and little roads, like we're limiting the potential of what we can do there. We need to partner with the county and entities that have access to the rest of the mountain and get some real stuff going there to bring real events out here, real money and real dollars, and with that, I think is large, we need some large sports complexes. We've got 40 acres, right? Out in my backyard. We need ball fields desperately, but a large center like that is a huge draw. West Jordan is gonna get rid of, they have like 12 fields. That is the only place, south of downtown? We have the rack that we all drive, an hour plus to, and it's too small. But West Jordan is trying to get rid of the small fields they have there. As soon as the airport moves, those are gone. It's a huge draw. There's tons of cities around the country that have put money into those complexes, and they're 30 to 40 acres. You need some contiguous fields there. We've spoken to Wendy and I have met with RSS several times. I talk till I'm blue in the face with those guys. Like, we need tournaments, and we can connect with you and hold championships games there, and the rest of the tournaments throughout the city. If we get some of those things going, then they support each other. We draw hotels, we draw the commercial, we draw all of that sort of stuff. But you have to have the draw for them. They all work together, right? And the definition of an economy is those interdependent facets, right? Not just one thing. If that makes sense. I go on, but that's the majority of what I prepared for you.
Remember those people, we met up with them, I think at one of the, maybe ICSCs from that, I can't remember now, the city that they had created one of those big sports complexes and stuff, and they're like, we'll come out and help you, we'll come out and show you things and different
That was
things.
a public-private partnership, wasn't it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of resources out there.
There's several. I've talked to people from, I think that one was Wisconsin.
Right.
I think Boise had done one with Simplots. That's where the Western Region Championships, a bunch of different sports are at. Florida, Texas, California, Vegas, tons of places have done it, and they're completely booked all the time. But we need other things besides housing. Yep, population gives us half of that 1%, but that's all it gives us. And then it gives us all of the services that we have to provide. So we have to balance that land use and be self-supporting.
I'm 100% on board with Jared's opinion of less housing, more things to do.
But we also have such a great amenity with the bike trails, and mountain biking has become such a big deal. We can do tournaments, those kind of things. We obviously have to have a big enough parking and those kinds of
You can
facilities.
do Ironmans, you can do
Yeah.
Spartan races, all that kind of stuff, but you have to have the facilities, you have to have the
Yeah.
parking, you have to have the roads to get people in and out. And if we actually put those roads past our commercial centers, then you capture that money as it comes in and out. And we have partners that, we've talked to Wasatch about that, with their center over there. Anthem, they'll all get on board, but we've talked about all these things for years, but there's no real plan in any of it.
So there's really no goals because nothing's been measurable. It's just concepts and ideas.
I'll just mention, Jared kind of triggered a thought in my head as he was talking through some of his stuff there, and it was related to road maintenance and the fact that, we've only done one increase to that budget in several years. It seems that as we go through this exercise and I'm interested to see what they were able to see a little bit of as far as the financial modeling stuff at some point. But it seems that one of our goals, and you guys can tell me if I'm way off base here, but it seems that one of our goals should be that as we capture new growth every single year, whatever percentage that is that it seems that we should be able to incrementally increase these other things along the way with that new growth. And if we're budgeting things right and we're looking, again, we have to get on top of the obligations and some of those things that we have some deficits in. But the longer, if we're not increasing these things as we're adding road miles and those things every year, to do that at least somewhat proportionally to the amount of increase we're seeing, all we're doing is creating a deficit that we're gonna have harder and harder time catching up. So again, figuring out that financial component and how we look at all things, put all these together, but find a way, again, as we start to plan on how we're gonna meet the obligations we have out there, but not leave some of these other critical components behind as we're doing that. That's in adding some percentage to each of these each year as growth continues to go, because again, you know, we're way behind on our road maintenance funds right now, and again, we all know too that that's just gonna cost us exponentially more money in the future to take care of those if we're not finding that money now.
What funds are we way ahead on?
Water.
Oh, so your utilities usually take care of themselves, right? Because you're structured. Streets, you bring up a great point. There's the old joke that history teachers think they should get paid more every year because there's always more history. Well, your streets are the same. Every time you add there's another street, you've got to deal with, you know, it's a brand new street. The developer gave us a brand new street. That's wonderful. In 8 years, it's going to need some work. What does that cost? And are you building a model to do that? So for those of you who weren't here, I'll just show quick. I know Steve's probably still getting hit. I don't want to, unless you're ready to talk, I can show this again. So this again is just it's a model. It's a model. It's based on assumptions that you put through here. You have. We've done one here where we're looking at what does that police department look like. And this isn't the one Alan's working on. This is one I copied and was messing with this weekend to try and see where are our trigger points. How do these assumptions impact our budget? So I understand. And I will say most of the time we spend. I will spend on the expense side because that's the side we can control. The revenue side, you can bring in new economic development, but you can't. One danger is, well, just make that sales tax grow faster. Okay. But unless you have something that tells you why, you know, you're going to get a big bump because your population is changing. With the census, that will be trying to capture that. But essentially, you can put this in here. So again, this is not the official one, but I started going through that same thought on streets. You got to start someplace, and these ones, your streets are all broken out on the other years. So just to plug it in, I started putting a number in, and this doesn't count your impact fee expenditures, right? That's in a different chart. So just say, if you're general fund, you got to deal with your ongoing maintenance. The study we had done said 4.2 million to get to a 75 PCI and 3.4, I think, to keep it at 70. I would say 75 is probably a stretch, so we should at least shoot for the 3.4. How do you get there? So you start building it together and saying, okay, we're $1 million, or you put 3 million, and then you start to deal with those others, and then I just built it up, and then I let it escalate after that. Again, because you got to. So some of that discussion, once this model is completely built, we need to talk with council and say, if we commit funds here, you can't use them other places, right? If you're committed to spending them on asphalt and streets, then you can't spend them on people or buildings,
Yeah.
right? So there's you have to find that balance. And at the staff level, we are going to talk a little bit about on it like a city roadmap, but
It's got.
realistically, where are we going and how do we grow? So, and this is not a knock on the police department or the public works, but they sent me their data on the building. So public works in 50 years is going to add 7 employees. That's probably not realistic. Justin's being super conservative. PD, no knock, chief, but they triple in size. So I look at that and I think, okay, I have two extremes. Somewhere is a more realistic middle. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that at staff level so we can share information and start to get feedback from council. But this model, throughout my career, has helped me understand when you make a commitment, what does it mean? So if you're gonna hire an employee and they say it's today, what does it mean in the future? When I took my job in Colorado, I came in, I was sworn in, and they had two police officers being sworn in that same day. And the chief leaned up to me and he goes, "They only budgeted for one in the budget, so I waited 6 months so I could hire two." I thought,
Wait, you can do that?
you should not do that. The council wasn't happy. I said, "Well, why'd you let him do it?" But, so we had this conversation that when you make that commitment, it's an ongoing commitment. And it's not just the personnel, it's the equipment that goes with that. And as you add, in different departments, if you add parks, every time you add a park, you gotta think about, okay, what maintenance does that require? What does it take to make sure that you have a park that looks good as opposed to a weed patch? What are those costs and maintenance? And so this model really just helps us try to outline that. Now, is it gonna be 100% accurate? No, it's really to just help us understand trends. And when so in 2008, when the recession hit, we were using this model in Colorado. We had already been looking at things, and so we made some adjustments in October, right as that all started. And we didn't lay anybody off, we just changed some of our plan, built it in there, and went through. Now, that, I always called that city the tortoise. They were slow and steady. They dipped a little bit, but they never went too deep. Some cities, I think, really got hit, but using this, we could also argue the reason why they dipped is because the council could see the impacts right away and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're gonna make this change, so we stepped back and made the change. Obviously, it's easier to make those slight course adjustments than trying to come to a complete stop or make a hard left or right, so we'll get this done. Like I said, I was hoping to have it done already, but we've got a lot of funds that are kind of interlinked. The general fund here doesn't really spend capital money, it transfers it and then it gets spent, so we wanna make sure that we capture what that looks like, so that you're gonna be more interested in some of your major funds. If you get out here to streetlights, it's such a small budget, I don't know that I may or may not. Street signs, it's such a small budget, we may not worry about it, although it's the first place I've ever been where we actually budgeted our street signs separately, so it's news for me, but, so that's that.
I think it's okay to have on there, I mean, just, if we never look at it, we never look at it, but if we wanna look at it.
We would, in other places, I would roll all those small ones into just one other budget, but it depends on the revenue streams, right? So if it's all general fund money, then you can just push them into the general fund.
Yeah.
If it has its own revenue source, like your public safety, you want to keep it separate. So that's, Alan was explaining to me, I was just like, man, we have a lot of little funds. But part of it is also trying to create some accountability for those managers, so.
So, you mentioned this, so I'll just ask the question. Have you and Alan had a chance at all yet to look at what potentially the new census numbers and how that may or may not affect the budget, what that really will look like moving forward?
We were just guessing last week, cause we didn't have the numbers, they came out today or, Thursday.
Thursday, so.
Yeah, so we haven't put it in, the state had us at, I think, about 51,000 for our distribution, so it'll go up a little bit, but again, the number we saw Thursday was 2020. We're in 2021, so there should be some adjustment through that, but they're also doing that in September this year instead of June. We will capture all that, and right now, that's what we've been trying to guesstimate, well, when does that change hit us, and how accurately are they capturing the growth that is happening? Regardless of annexation, we have a lot of homes going in, we have a lot of lots entitled, and so we should see.
To me, that's what I've heard a lot from the legislature, the rationale of that distribution is that half of the sales tax is for their home city to provide service.
We're also seeing some, the, point of purchase for the, Amazon at Beacon is changing pretty drastically for us. And I think Alan told me that we're really starting to see a pickup in the Anthem development and some of those other things where we're really seeing Winco and that are starting to pick up.
They
Yeah.
talked about that on LPC today, about more legislation talking about that, things like that, and then they showed a chart of different cities and which cities really started to spike in online purchases for point of sale in the residential. So some of that might balance out, maybe it wouldn't change. Again, that's always on the table, it seems like the legislature, but it's something to be for sure aware of.
If you ask Roger too, his opinion of that, he has a pretty strong one of whether the legislature even can change that. That'll be an interesting conversation for sure.
I've never seen the legislature afraid to do something they weren't allowed to.
That's what he said.
It's just whether the court will uphold them later, they'll just do it.
Good point.
And we'll be scrambling, trying to make it work and.
Yeah, to me, that comes back to, it shouldn't matter what the formula is if you have an actual economy in place, right?
Yeah.
Those self-supporting things, it doesn't matter how you split it up, if you have all of those elements that support each other and but if we have too much of one thing versus another, then those changes can greatly affect us.
Balance is always the thing, right? We've talked about a lot of times in a lot of meetings is balance in our community. We've been talking about that through the MDA for Olympia, those types of things. It's like it's just about balance. It's not about overwhelming a community with one type of housing or those types of things, but we have to find balance. And really quite frankly, we have to have some pretty good data, I think, in front of the council that really demonstrates that. Where are we lacking? Where, what are we missing? Here's the percentages, those kind of things. Here's what we gotta have here to establish balance. I don't really think that we have a good tool for that, at least wise. I don't know of one. Do you guys know of a good tool for that we've been utilizing?
We paid Zions a bunch of money to do a study several years ago and it's kind of sat on a shelf. Same thing, like we've done these things along the way, but like there's never been a cohesive plan with accountability and benchmarks.
The one thing I will say is it's a rapidly growing community and some of the areas where you do that, you're just thin on the staff person to run it, right? We just don't have, Public Works says in 50 years we're gonna add 7 people. In some towns, yes, cause if you're fully built out, you're probably not adding much, but in this place, even if you don't annex anything, every time they open a new subdivision, we gain more roads and so there's this, trying to come up with that balance. And so building that plan, that's what I would kind of term some of the tactical plan once council establishes, here's our strategy. And so actually it would be very valuable, I think, for the council to go through a true strategic planning discussion. And you don't have to agree on things, but if you can come to a spot where you say, yes, this is the direction we wanna go. We want the community to be like this, to have this, a balanced economy. And I'll tell you, my mentor, would have given that exact same lecture to me. About balancing the community externally and then internally with your staff to make sure you don't if you spend all your money on law enforcement, you might be safe, but nobody will live there. Right? You don't have any of the amenities that draw people. That would be like Stockton in California. If you haven't been there, there's a reason you haven't been there. So those are the kind of that challenge. So I actually written down a ton of from Steve. Counselor Shields is.
I always find these exercises challenging. There's so many things that, depending on your point of view, I could either strongly agree with or vehemently disagree with. And that's part of the problem with, I think, so much of what, at least the method in which we're going through this is that, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this the right way. It's like we're arguing over which car we're gonna drive, which direction we're gonna go, how many people are gonna fit in it, and how much we wanna pay for gas, and who's gonna drive, and we don't have any idea where we're going. And so, all those things could be important, but if we have no idea what the destination is, I don't know if any of those are important or not. I hear advocating for, austerity measures and a balance. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. I hear, we need nothing but key components, and that's what we need to focus on. And we need parks and entertainment and recreation and things that bring people, right? Like, this isn't binary choices. This is a complex, multivariate system of inputs here. It is, I guess I would say it this way. I'd say that our assumptions need to be based on data. Assumptions and assertions, I would say. They need to be backed up by realistic data. 5 acres of apartments provides far more revenue to the city than 5 acres of commercial does. But we don't want 5 acres of apartments necessarily, depending on where it is and when it is and what features are going in around it, right? So whether we're going to pull this lever or this lever or this lever, I think we need data to drive those decisions. I also think that making decisions in a vacuum is unwise. So I appreciate the idea that you're asking us to create a 3-year or a 5-year plan, because then that helps you know you can't pull this lever if you want to get here. I've used this analogy a ton of times, and sorry if I'm abusing it, but I go back to the Alice in Wonderland Cheshire Cat thing, right? She comes to a fork in the road. Which road should I take? She asks the cat. The cat says, well, where do you want to go? Alice responds, I don't know. The cat says, well, then it doesn't matter which road you take, right? So for us, deciding what's the right path for us forward, it really depends on where we're trying to get to. And so I think there's elements that have been discussed tonight that are parts of what we want to get to. But again, it's in the absence of a cohesive vision and a destination, it's hard for me to say if any of these suggestions are ultimately good or bad, right or wrong. I'm supporting this, not supporting that. So I'm not here to necessarily criticize anybody's suggestions. It's hard for me to support it in the absence of what am I trying to work for? Does that make sense?
I don't know that anybody's asking for support, we're asking for your ideas for those things. What are your ideas?
Again, I can suggest my ideas, but they're based on,
We have to have a starting point, short term, long term, all things that you said,
we have a starting point.
there's a point here.
This is
and a
where we
point
are
here.
today. We have a starting point.
Exactly,
The
so.
point is, where do we want to go from here?
So our vision is that,
That is the current
I-
vision.
Which is,
20 years old.
And every time anybody talks about that, every time we've talked about that vision in the last several years, I feel like there's been an attempt to not change it because we want to appease whoever, whether it's the person who wrote it or people who've worked here for a long time or lived here for a long time or people coming in. Frankly, I think that vision statement is not that good. And
I would agree, and I think there's elements of it that
sure,
potentially are in conflict with each other, and they should be vetted out a little bit. I mean, we want, opportunity and economic development, and then we want, our, heritage and our community identity and Harriman feel, and how do we balance those things, right? I'm not saying they're not, it's not either or, but we have to discuss how we would balance those things, right? And I apologize, I'm not giving good
so is your,
input here, I'm trying to figure it out in a.
so is your
In a vacuum.
thought that we need to start with the vision? Is that what you're saying? Is your thought saying that we need to start with the general plan? Like what do you, where, in your opinion, what's the next step?
I feel like I'm having a conversation with my wife about what do you want for dinner, right? Like, what do you want for dinner? Well, I don't know, what do you want? Well, what about this? Well, I don't really like that. I'd rather, well, what about this? Well, I don't really like that.
You've been listening to my conversations.
Yeah, that's every conversation, right? So, okay, well, let's just cook something. Well, what do you want? Why don't we see what ingredients we have? Maybe that'd be a good place to start, right? I just don't know. It's.
The problem is, and I run into this in my profession, right, so helping people plan for retirement. Talk to a 20-year-old about planning for retirement, that's a lot different than talking to a 60-year-old.
Sure.
And even for that 60-year-old, sometimes there's too much unknown, right? But their question to me is always, how do I get there? Like, well, there's two things I need to know to help you. One is I need to know where you're at right now, right? Where is your, what assets do you have, and where is your money going? And then where do you think? And it's okay if you don't know the exact destination, because it's in the future, and there's so many variables between now and then that'll determine what that might be, right? So right now I can say, well, I wanna get out of here and move to the Caribbean. I'll tell you right now, that's what I wanna do. 20 years from now, we'll see if that's still the same answer when we find out where my kids end up, right? What my health situation really is, et cetera, et cetera. But I have to ask them, what do you think you want to do? What are the likely possibilities? And we kind of keep the door open for all of those, working with what we have. And then it's kind of this same process. Short term, okay, well, to operate the next 3 to 5 years, right? That's the short term plan. Where's the money going? What are some changes we can make to put ourselves in a better position to get to where we think we might? And that destination will always change. They call it kind of a rolling 5 to 10 years.
Sure, and we're making plans, and
Right.
other
So,
people
and
are
I think
gonna
that's
have
the same.
to be there for retirement.
That's kind of, well, it's not maybe, it's definitely how I looked at this when Nathan sent this out. I was like, well, that makes sense to me, because that's planning, right? Where do we think we want to be? And there's many possibilities to where we think we want to be. But there's gonna be a ton of things that change between here and there. At the same time, we have to run the city today and assess what our assets are, what our liabilities are, and where we're putting that money right now. And so we have to kind of work at both ends, but the more important one is today, and putting ourselves in a better position to be able to make those decisions tomorrow.
So I would say then, in that vein, cause I don't disagree with you, right? I get it there, we have to come up with some things that we're gonna be doing, right? I think some everybody mentioned kind of pieces this, but I think it's really understanding, government finance really just is horrible. It's what I call the bean counting method of, accountability, right? It's, general fund balance. We're just counting a pile of beans in the corner. If the beans pile gets bigger, we must be doing something right. If the beans get too low, or we must be doing something wrong. I'm not worried about the pile of beans. We're not worried about where the beans come from and how many beans we need to eat to feed the family and how many beans we're gonna replant next year, and we're just measuring the size of the pile. And so it's not anybody's fault. That's not the point here, but there's so much information that's just lacking in helping us make decisions and write things. We don't know really what our revenue is going to be, because that's kind of changing in a kind of a moving target. And I don't think any of us truly understand what all our obligations are now and next year and a few years from now. We know there's roads that have to be built. For obligations we have, it's a whole nother discussion. We know there's economic development efforts going underway. Why, when, how, what are the primary goals? What kind of economic development do we want? Where are we gonna put it? And what's guiding that decision? You know what I mean? Do we have the right data that's saying we should have this kind of development in this place and it'll produce this much revenue, and you need this many rooftops to support that much density of commercial, right? We need some employment centers that are gonna help support the commercial during the day, and then how many people is that gonna make, and where are those people gonna live? And it's understanding the interplay of all these things that I just don't know. And I realize it's such a difficult thing. We get asked to make these decisions and approve budgets and all these things. It's almost the machine of government just goes forward. And there's not really a method that I've seen so far that helps me understand revenues, expenses, long-term obligations, short-term obligations, just this general financial outlook. And then that gives us at least some constraints on our decision-making, at least lets us know what things we can make decisions about. I mean, if we've got $5 million of money we're supposed to be making decisions over, and we've got $10 million in obligations, we don't really have $5 million of money to make decisions over, right? I mean, we don't get decisions over the water budget. Water comes in, pays for water stuff, HEC money comes in, goes to pay for public safety. We're gonna have fire comes in, goes to pay for fire stuff, right? It's, all those things kind of pay for each other. We get this small amount of money over which we're supposed to exercise discretion to execute a long strategic plan, but I'm doing it in a vacuum. To your point, we could say, we're gonna spend this money this year on these things. But will we have enough money to pay for what we need next year? I don't know. So when I say that I'm, and I apologize for my lack of specificity and direction here, but I'd be just telling you some wishes I have, not being able to say, this is what I think we should do and why. I can say, well, I don't know, I think maybe this sounds like a good idea, it's a cool buzzword, it makes people happy, but I just don't know. We want to increase our budget for fixing roads. I don't know if we can. And if we can't, how do we fix it?
So what you're saying is you need data.
I need a lot of information to
So,
be able to make, at least to give direction. I mean, it's like we're all in a boat and we're all rowing a different oar. And we don't even know, the river's just carrying us along, but none of us are actually steering,
So I totally support Steve in the intent here of this.
And I apologize, I
No,
don't mean
it's
to piss on anybody's.
No, you're not. I think it's a valid argument, and I think that, I've said this for a long time, that I think that an informed group always makes a better decision. You have the right information, you can always make a better decision. So, I would fully support giving staff short-term direction to start working on putting more of that, so it's clearer and easier for staff, or for this body and the public, because this body comes from the public, to understand what is actually going on with our finances at any particular time.
And so I really support your model effort. Like, if you were asking me short-term, absolutely, get that thing done and fleshed out and robust and, get some chunky stuff for us to work with, right? you know, the budget's great as Alan is with budget, there's some limitations to that, right? It doesn't give us it's a 1-year budget, it's not, we're not understanding it in the context of multiple years, right? I would say that I really think that we should be working on a budget that does have one-time money pays for one-time things and ongoing revenues pay for ongoing operations, right? I think that's a great financial goal to have. I don't know how we can get there, and I don't know if we can get there yet, but that's a good goal. I don't know if that's something we can do next year, 3 years, 5 years, or it's gonna take 20 years before we
That's
can
what we
get to that
hired
point.
him to tell us.
Yeah, but
But that, I mean, that is the question.
we need him to tell us, we just haven't been told yet, right?
That is the question, is in order for him to do his job, he's asking us, in the next 12 months, 1 year, what are some of the things you'd like answers to?
Yeah.
Right? He's not asking you for what the answers are. He
Yeah,
wants, what do you want to know to
Thank
make
you for
decisions?
saying it that way, Jerry. I feel like we're trying to give answers and we're trying to give answers, what we need is to get answers. Does that make sense? And I suppose that's kind of the conundrum I find myself in, is trying to give direction, but I need stuff before I
That's
can
why I
give
said,
people
look,
something.
we need to know definitively, what are our obligations?
What are our
MBAs and CBAs, really what are we looking at?
Yeah.
Right? But you and I've had that discussion a million times, like how can we make decisions of where new money goes if we don't know what old money is supposed to go?
Yeah, then we have stuff like, not to get into something, but, you know, the discussion we had the other night. There's suddenly a pretty big expense that comes up, right? Kind of, holy crap, unexpectedly, we thought the road was gonna go this way, now the road's going this way, and we have to pay for this part. And we thought that part was gonna get paid for, and so we had plans, and even if those plans were good, we just found out something's gonna change some of those, right? So there, to your point, there's flexibility that has to be built into some of that too, and contingencies.
And those
and
are
all
the
that kind of stuff.
short-term decisions, right?
Right.
So if we leave sometimes at least in my world, an emergency fund or a buffer, right? If you free up some of that short-term money instead of spending it all because you just have,
Right,
I tell my clients all the time is that if your money doesn't have a purpose, it will disappear, right? But just, if it's in that checking account on Friday, it's not there on Monday, typically, right? There's always some, I give my wife a hard time, there's always something that we need, right? And if there's money there, it
We
gets
get it.
used, right?
Yeah.
If I look at that checking balance and I see that savings balance staring at me on the same screen, we can just borrow and pay ourselves back, right? You fall into that. You have to separate it for those separate purposes, and if you do that, when something comes up and you have money set aside, then you can take advantage of that opportunity or take care of that emergency, et cetera. But if we haven't done those short-term things,
which
and
is,
that, and correct me if
is-
I'm wrong, Nathan, but like in my mind, planning wise, like that's the first step that he's going for here is, okay, what are those?
yeah. And then the other problem is because we just found out, we can't save for every contingency, we can only save so much.
And there's some things you just can't do,
Right.
right? You just have to say, no, we're not gonna go on that trip.
So,
And when I appreciate the way you explained it there too, because, for my stuff, when I brought up roads, it wasn't that and I hope nobody took it, I was saying, these are the roads I think we need to put on the plan. Mine is, we know these roads are an issue, but we need to understand what the full obligation is there and how do we prioritize accomplishing those, both the promises we've made and the failures that we know we have.
Right.
And we have to understand the data, the money as
Yeah.
it gets there to
You
help
might have
us
a
make those
sinkhole that we
decisions.
don't know about,
Yep.
right? It's gonna open up under a main road somewhere,
That was my whole point about the orchard, what trees are sick,
right?
do we know? Do we know?
Got some sick trees in my yard right now.
Yeah, but
Well-
do we know which one need pruned, do we know which,
Well, and
we
we've
just have to
done,
understand that.
like I said, we've done a lot of that work. I mean, we just did the road
We
study,
still have a plan to utilize it.
right? We did the science-based economics study. We've done a lot of those things, but haven't actually done anything with them.
Yeah.
And I tell my clients this all the time, really, you've done a lot of the things you're supposed to do. You've just never put it on one page and put it into a workable plan.
Yeah,
And so,
measurable.
all I'm gonna do is help you organize what you've done and what you're doing, so you can see where you're going.
That's what
Right.
Nathan said at first, he's like, these aren't goals, because there's nothing measurable on any of this. We have, oh, this is good ideas, these are good ideas.
So
Why would-
we've done a lot of
Yeah.
those things, but we haven't really put them in a form that shows us where we're going.
Yeah.
Correct any of my wording, Nathan, that's just at least, like, my planning brain, that's,
Well, I would agree that the city has a lot of, they've got a lot of the pieces, even for the 5-year capital plan, right? It's kind of a best practices, you have 5 years, you know what's coming. The first 3 years are pretty solid, 4 and 5 may move a little bit because of other opportunities. And there's always a parking lot out here of other projects that are moving forward, but it allows you to know where you're at. And so we're pursuing putting it together. I think we have all the parts and pieces, we just have never put it in a way that helps Alan and the city manager, when you're putting
Right.
together a budget, to be able to say, or council, if you commit to something, you can put it out there, okay, we're gonna do this and it's in 3 years. You put it on there, so it's staring at you as you're coming up to your budget, we have to fund this. It shouldn't be a surprise, it helps you know what obligations you make. Now, figuring out all the ones we've made in the past is its own challenge at the moment, but
And the hard part is we look at things like, you know, excess fund balance, right? That's this magic number of this, how many extra beans we have. And in government accounting, we have to spend it, right? The question is, you know, like a public works facility. The decision for some gets boiled down to, well, do we have enough revenue to equal that obligation? You can look at it in a vacuum and go, well, here's our budget this year, sure, we can do that. And so we'll do that and that'll be fine. But then that's $2 million a year that we don't have to spend on other things. And we don't know if we're gonna need $2 million next year or 2 years from now for other things. Does that make sense? So,
remember, we've talked about that,
yeah,
opportunity cost.
so I would say, yeah, really understanding obligations and expenses that we haven't considered. Obligation expenses we'd like to consider, and how do we prioritize those, right? And then, I think really coming with a plan to deal with the stuff we just don't know yet, right? How are we gonna, like, we don't know how many roads we're gonna have, but if we have a plan that says for every excess mile of road we add, we're gonna plan on increasing the road budget by X. Okay, that's great, but when you increase the road budget, that's less money you have for other things you may have planned. So we gotta understand, can we do some of these things and how? And my apologies, that's a very scattered conversation, and I'm not contributing a lot to the suggestions here. But this, how I've contemplated, it's like I was thinking about these big questions, you know, what does success look like? If you don't have that, if you don't have your scoreboard, I don't know if you're winning or losing, right? So, sorry.
Participation trophy for everyone.
Yeah, right.
You know.
Anyway, what that means, yeah.
Can I? Well, two quick points, yeah.
We're gonna share a gold medal, you kidding me?
Okay.
Just 2 quick points. I mean, I think the one thing that we've all said is that we need to really understand what our obligations are. Because that, honestly, once we really understand what that is, that may make our decision-making process for the next couple of years very easy.
Yeah.
Well, there it is, okay, done,
Right.
you know? So, I think we're all looking for that clarity on that stuff. Nathan, I guess it's a little bit of probably a philosophical question maybe for you, but how will you share that, once we get this dialed in and we have what those priorities are, how will you, I guess, share that across the rest of the departments, and what's your vision of how they will then support that, feed into that, help us accomplish those things? You know, a few years ago, in the city, you know, we had what was referred to as the top 5, I think. Steve, I don't think you were here then, but we had the top 5, and, you know, and it was fairly effective at the time, I think. We had top 5 goals of the overall city, and then each department's top 5 had to in some way align with or help accomplish those things. And, in order to be effective as a team and as a city, we all have to be working towards the same common goal. So I guess my question is beyond identifying what the goals are, what's your vision of how we actually get everyone working in the same direction to accomplish that?
Thank you, that's actually a great question. So you build a strategic plan, I think that's what you're talking about. You get all this data underneath, you say, okay, now go do it. And that, for lack of better terms, if you're talking strategy, that's the tactics. Okay, we're going to go do this. And ideally, you create the goals in a way that you can reference them easily, right? It's goal 1, subsection 1, okay, that's run. You can focus all the way down to your employee evaluation, talking, okay, I need you to do this because it gets us to here. If you can, in a perfect world, you can do that. I'll say, I've never been able to get everybody's goals to perfectly mesh just because there are so many
Sure.
other things.
Right.
And most of the goals that council's gonna set are gonna be high level strategy. We want to, improve roads, right? That's your goal. That's your strategic objective, and then we have to come up with, okay, in the next 3 years, we're going to do this, or the next year, we're gonna do this, the year 3, we're gonna do this. Measurable things that we can look at and see, okay, did we accomplish it? And at the same time, we also have to be looking, we've accomplished this, did it make a difference? We're talking about effectiveness versus efficiency. If you're doing something, you're doing it really well, but it doesn't move the needle, whether it's the way your citizens feel about the streets, they're still terrible. You put all this money in it, okay, you've missed it somehow. Right? You're missing how to do that. Public safety is a great one, right? What is it that people, they want to feel safe and secure? Sometimes that's law enforcement. Public safety I view as a much bigger circle than just law enforcement plays a part. There's all these other pieces that help people feel. So for us, what we'll do, you do need a strategic plan. And I was happy to hear that you're willing to talk about this. I was told that this is kind of like a sacred thing that nobody ever wants to touch, from several people. And I think it's more because you look at it and, no offense, we could take out Herriman City and Harriman Field, substitute something else, and it would probably fit. The live, work, play statement, I can think of at least 4 or 5 cities I know that use that, live, work, play. I think a consultant came up with it once, and now it's just good copy, and they got it trademarked so they can,
Like we use for
get some money.
multi-use development.
So I'm glad you're talking about that. I think really, what I was hoping to get from Dan, I think actually I got it, is we need to know where we want to focus as a staff to bring you. So if you need this information, you hit the part, well, how do you budget? Ultimately, that's council's, that's where we're gonna present you a bunch of data. And you'll say, well, what if we do this? Then we can show, well, this is what we think will happen
Right.
based on this. You all ultimately have to decide those opportunity costs. If we do X, we can't do Y. What is your constituent want? I recognize I work for the citizens, but I'm accountable to you all. And so you're the ones who get their feedback probably daily, depending on how they're mad at something, but that's where that will ultimately come down to as we're having that budget discussion. And I don't know how you've done your budget hearings, I have to look at Utah law. But usually there's some dialogue that goes on as you're saying, here's what we think is happening. Does this meet your intent? Is this what you want?
To be honest, though, at least from my opinion, we've never had that conversation. The budget just moves forward and here's a date and here's what we've presented and, we'll roll it off on the next date and then it goes to the next date and it just gets approved and moves forward. We've never had a strategic summit where we're like,
In depth.
yeah, these are the things we approve or not approving and why.
Well, and I would
Right.
say that usually councils don't get down into, cause I've had councils that wanna get down to, well, how come they're spending $50 more in office supplies this year than last year?
No.
And this city has done that in the past.
And so there's that danger, but when you say, okay, we're going to invest in we're gonna put this much money into ongoing maintenance in streets. And because we're doing that, we can't buy X this year.
Right.
Right, we're gonna do this year, next year, we're gonna delay this a year. Well, those kind of strategic, yeah, let's delay that.
We're gonna have to
No,
fix that
let's
truck
not.
and buy the new truck next, yeah, that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
those are, that overall high direction is really where council needs to be looking at it and saying, yes, this is where we wanna go. And I've talked, and Alan and I've had some conversations, we're now getting to the point as a large enough city, we may wanna think about, do we want to lease all of our vehicles, or should we be cash funding some of those? Cause when you lease them, yes, you got it today, you didn't pay as much, but you're paying interest on it every year, and over time, that can be fairly significant. Now, you could also, Enterprise will come in here and tell you they'll run their fleet for you, and you'll just turn your F-150s over every year, because we can buy them cheaper than they'll resell them at a profit. It just feels a little bit like dirty. That'll require some sort of grand jury investigation. So I've never been a fan of that, but I do think we wanna think about some of those decisions, but that would be council, we say, here's why, we propose you do this, or keep this, and here's why, but ultimately you can weigh all that data and say, we think we want it to do it this way. And then we take those marching orders and we run with them. So what I anticipate coming out of this is probably some higher level goals than we'll, at least for the interim, before we bring a strategic plan, and frankly, that will be one of these goals, we need to do that. But then we can come up with some measurable goals underneath, we can do in the short term.
Let me give you a very specific example of why I think we need more information. I'm gonna use Olympia Hills as a very specific example here. There are questions. Would annexation be a good thing or a bad thing? Is it the right decision or is it the wrong decision? Is it beneficial for our city or is it harmful to our city? And the answer to all those questions is, I don't know. We don't know yet. We have some information that answers some of those questions. We don't have all of the information to answer all of those questions. And it depends on kind of what your long-term vision plan for everything is, right? I mean, I could sit here and argue it's wonderful thing and it's a great budget solution and it provides tons of revenue for future obligations and lets the city expand and do creative things and brings in, businesses and commercial opportunities, and you can make all those arguments, right? And I think there's data and evidence that might support some of that. I think you can also go, it's going to, cause infrastructure failures and we're taking on obligations that we can't afford and we're, not clearly understanding what our long-term obligations are in terms of what the short-term gains would be. We haven't really put it into our, does it keep the Herriman feel? All of those kind of things. And so, as a council, we end up relying on our opinions. We're arguing about esoteric kind of philosophical things rather than material data-driven kind of decisions. And so I'm grateful for so much effort and energy that's put into getting the data, to getting information, to outlining facts and information that help us to understand that. But that's just one specific example. And we have dozens and dozens and dozens of decisions to make all the time about auto malls and economic development and annexation and zoning plans and should this 15 acres be commercial or should we change it to residential and why? And we're supposed to make all of these complex decisions based off of, maybe it's good, you know what I mean? And it's frustrating to me. So that's just one example of you can get so much disagreement, but we're disagreeing on guesstimates, right? We're disagreeing on philosophy. We're not disagreeing on data, and that's it's hard for me as a member of a body that's supposed to deliberate and discuss things, that we get bogged down for 2 hours on discussions about less substantive things and not enough discussion about really substantive things, if that
Not to
makes
throw
sense.
a wrench in that, but the problem with relying on data and numbers is that I can make them say whatever you want them to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When they're talking about planning in the future, assumptions. Client says, I want to have $1 million when I retire. Alright, well, how aggressive do you wanna be with the investment? What do you mean? Well, that's gonna largely determine the assumption that I can make on how quickly it's gonna grow. If you tell me that you're really conservative, you don't wanna take any risk at all, right?
Right.
Then I'm using a much lower number, which means you're gonna have to put in a lot more of your own money, right? And there's just, in 5.5, going on 6 years, any data you want, any data that's put in front of us is of that nature. It's generally what someone wants us to go within one direction, right? I
Well,
think sometimes.
To a point, but to your, but
sometimes
Jared,
it's-
if you're
sometimes
talking
it's-
about financial planning, there are inputs,
That's
and
that-
there's a formula.
That's my point, is
But
that
if you're
not all the inputs are known. You have to use assumptions for a lot of those inputs.
Sure.
And that's absolutely what we're supposed to represent our constituents on. And those are opinions. Some people would rather be more conservative than more aggressive,
Sure.
right?
But
It's not, well, I guess my
But
point
to a
Steve,
point is
is
there's
it's
at
not
least-
all, it's not all black and white, especially in government.
I get it.
Like, you're never gonna get to
I
that.
totally understand, but at least in finance, there's a formula. And you know what the assumptions are and why you're making those assumptions, and you're basing those assumptions off of other data.
But-
Right, you don't just put in a financial model that, your
Are you
value of money interest rate is gonna be 172%.
Are we conservative or are
That's
we
ridiculous.
aggressive? There are some aspects of the formula that are known, and there are others that are assumptions.
Sure.
That's what this body's supposed to do, is discuss.
Some of those assumptions are that we're
Like,
gonna
we-
continue to grow at the same rate that we have without any effect in the economy, and that could change 3 years from now without.
Olympia Hills as an example, there are so many assumptions made, it's ridiculous, right? And we will never agree, our constituents will never agree on all of the inputs in that formula, just won't. There's 2 or 3 known things, and that's about it. The rest of it is what is our opinion on what the other assumptions should be for the outcome that we think it would give us.
Fair enough.
There just is never gonna be that nailed down formula for everything. And that's why we have to start out with kind of a philosophical discussion. What is the end game, right? So what does success look like for you? To me, after 5.5 years of experience of this and 2 years before that as a community organizer, my definition of success is that the city is financially stable regardless of potential growth. To me, and again, I'll break that down, to me, that means that you can take that down to the nth degree. That's the philosophical part of where, the idea of where I want to get to, right? And then, yeah, there's tons of planning and tons of assumptions in between, but that's the general idea where I wanna get to. Don't wanna have to worry about what impact fees we're gonna collect next year to pay for what we owe this year, right? And there are ways to get there, but we have to have some goal in the future, and then we have to figure out what our starting point is, right? So what are the things realistically, what can we get within the next 12 months to help make some of these decisions?
Yeah.
And then what are kind of some targets for the next 3 to 5 years, things that we know we need to do, but we don't necessarily have the time to do it in the next 12 months. So break it down into steps, right? And that's all planning is. And it is frustrating, but again, that to me, that's, I hate to say politics, but it is, right? It's this body. If this were a business, no problem, right? Because there might be I shouldn't say no problem, because then I get politics too. There's a board of directors, right? Whatever, it's the same sort of thing, but it's his job to make sure that we're going towards that ultimate goal. Right? And then it's the board's job, our job,
To say what that goal is.
to say, that's to tell them, yep, that's still the goal, and what progress have you made towards it, right? Hold them accountable. Are we moving towards that or not?
And, thank you, Jared, I really appreciate that, I can't disagree with you, right? I do understand it's an imperfect science, right?
And
We have to make decisions based on imperfect and
You all know I get
incomplete data.
frustrated more than anybody.
Right.
I'm not good at hiding that.
I understand. I guess I would just say, I'd like to get more complete, more perfect data to help me make more reasonable assumptions in what I'm asking to do. I guess that would be a good place to start.
Well, with the financial model, once we get it built, I mean, that's one of the things, is it's driven by assumptions. So when we say, well, let's do this, we can take a step back and kind of say, well, what if those assumptions change? What if you hit a recession? How does that look?
Can we build that in to where we see a best case, worst case scenario every time we try to make, like, so that it just automatically generates a best case, worst
I mean,
case?
essentially
Well,
what we would do
finance
is,
that I always learned is you have, very conservative, a likely, and an optimistic,
Yeah.
right? You know,
Like, that would be helpful to, because, and I think that would go to my comment earlier about always being overly conservative. I want to see what the conservative numbers are, I just don't want to, I would also like to see what the likely numbers really actually are. So if we did optimistic, likely, and conservative, I think that would be really helpful for this body moving forward to be able to say, all right, this is what's reasonable, this is what's not. I agree with Jared, in all honesty, I think, he's made a lot of good points there. I'd say, for me, if I had to give the two things that I keep thinking to myself, if I leave office and this community is if public safety is taken care of, i.e. the police department, fire department, and we are financially stable for the long term, I've essentially done my job. It could have been done a different way, there's rights, there's wrongs, there's things that could have gone better, but all in all, if the public is safe and we are financially stable long term, I can walk away knowing that, all right, I set it up right so that this body can leave, I can continue to move that process forward. So for me, long-term, overall vision statement kind of goals are those two things, public safety and financially stable. Everything after that starts to move down into specifics.
I think that's the thing is, you said really all the things that come to my mind. When I talk to my neighbors, right, the things that come up the most are, if there's, like we've talked before, none of my neighbors talk about chickens, probably just because they know not to talk about chickens.
Oh, we needed that.
I've had a lot of chicken conversations in my career.
Sorry.
But as Chief always says, if there's a problem, I want somebody to show up quickly, right? Like that's public safety. I want my kid to be able to ride his bike down the street, right? If something happens, I want somebody to show up, not within a reasonable amount of time. If I turn the faucet on, I want water to be there, right? If I need to go to work tomorrow, I want the road to be plugged, right? If I'm driving, there's a pothole, I want that pothole to be filled. That's one I do get every single day. Say, come just drive to my house, you'll understand. Or talk to the roads department. Sidebar. I'd like to know how much we're spending just on Heritage Drive on patching every year versus redoing it.
right.
Anyway, but I appreciate the patching that they're doing. But it's
That's a good
those
question to ask,
essential
though.
things, right? That if that they expect the city to do, that is our responsibility to do. That's, to me, that's the focus, and that we should be able to provide those things indefinitely. To me, that's what being financially stable means, is that we provide all of those things we're
Agreed.
supposed to.
Can I add one comment to this that
No.
I think
You'll have three.
this goes to your question that you asked, Nathan, right, about how does this translate into what happens behind the scenes? How does this direction impact the goals and direction of things that happen with staff? I think there's such an aspect about this that we have neglected to take advantage of, and that is it's not council and staff, it's council and staff together, right? That there's for whatever reasons, I think council gets frustrated with staff recommendations sometimes because they don't answer all these questions that we're asking, right? The recommendation may be perfect, and we would be in total agreement with it if we understood what all of the inputs and the you know, the assumptions that were made around that suggestion, right? So, understanding what a suggestion is, what the recommendation is, and why. What are the things that were considered, and you know, what drove that kind of decision making? That really helps.
I think
As
as
a
a
council,
model will
right?
help with the.
Yeah, I
learning, right?
agree.
Because a lot of times those suggestions are, here's what we suggest to fix this, whatever this issue is.
Right.
And in this year's budget, but it doesn't say the effect on next year's or 5 years from
Right,
now.
right.
Which is a lot of times what we wanna know, right? Well, if we do that now, we put out this other thing, what does that mean for the plans we have over here?
And the problem is we don't know what the plans are yet, right? We're guessing.
So that's where we have to have
Yeah.
that starting
And-
point.
And that's not fair to staff and their
Exactly.
budgets either, cause we make a decision and we just wrecked what they thought was gonna happen next year, you know?
Right.
So that this ability to have a circle of input and feedback and, right, I think is really, really, is not functioning as well as I would like it to in our city, and I think it's really critical to us making better decisions going forward.
Well, to your point, Steve, I think when it comes to the staff component, obviously, they do have to make some assumptions.
Yeah.
At times, and to your point, we don't know, we think that they're making an assumption that we would make when they're not.
Right.
And so that's where we've missed, and so there is that, sometimes that miscommunication piece of whether it's because I wasn't clear enough in what I was really asking for, whatever it is,
Yeah.
you know.
And it goes back and forth, right?
Yeah.
Staff can make recommendations and we go a different direction, they're like, the council's idiots, why did they do that, right?
Well, I just wasted 5 hours of my
Yeah,
time,
exactly.
they didn't even ask me
Right.
for it.
And and they're like, they didn't even ask me any
Right.
questions about this, right? And on the other hand, staff makes a recommendation, and we're like, why would you possibly recommend that? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all, right? And I think to your point, we're not understanding what the assumptions are, we're not understanding what the data inputs that you're using are and why.
And that's where I think the strategic plan, i.e. the priorities, the goals that we
Yeah,
have.
start to align us and them, right?
Everybody, and so that, now we're all playing off of the same assumptions.
Right.
And we understand what that data is when it comes back to us and where it came from.
Actually, that is incredibly helpful that we're all using the same assumptions, and I think in the short term, we can do a better job on our staff reports, just telling you, here are some of the assumptions we're making.
Yes.
Now, I spend more time thinking finance, so I'm always thinking financial, but there are other times we're
Sure.
making assumptions about, here's why we think you should do this, and here's the assumption. So you could look at that assumption and say, I don't agree with it, and that's fine. As long as you have I think it would be this, but then at least you understand why we thought this makes sense. We can do that. Actually, this has been I don't know what the other staff think. This has been very helpful and enlightening to me to understand a little bit. On our obligations, with the MDAs and all that, we're gonna need a staff and come up with a plan to try and get our arms around. I think Blake said he went through them once. So some of it, and you know that some of our past MDAs will go in the category of what not to do examples, and they're very confusing. You read through and say, what does this actually mean? And some of it, we're gonna make an assumption about what we think they mean, and we'll spell that out. We'll probably just give you the language so you can read it, and if we get 5 attorneys in the room, we'll get 7 opinions about what it means.
It's just like the council.
So it's that, we can start putting some of that together.
He's the top attorney.
And I will tell you that you really don't have a large staff for a community this size, right? And there's only so much capacity, and I think some of the balls you see dropped are simply because they have too many things they're trying to do, and they don't have enough time to focus and say, okay, how do we get this? And so that is a challenge for me, and we're talking about it with staff. Where does that staff where would be the best investment in that capacity so we can move some things forward?
And
Yeah,
in
that's
all
a good
honesty,
point, too.
Nathan,
Bring that
that
back.
frustrates me, because every single year in the budget, that is my number one question, is where do we need staff where we're not getting it? And every single year, I get told, oh, well, the managers have looked this over, the managers really, they've come up with a good plan, and I just don't feel like we've done that. Now, I'm not around to set up another budget anymore, but that really frustrates me, because the last 4 years I've asked about who
But you know
needs
what,
more
dude,
staff.
the I would give the feedback though, how do they know what it is we're trying to get them to accomplish? So how do they know if their staffing is right, you know what I mean?
That's fair.
They can't do. They are doing the best they can based on incomplete and you know, somewhat unreliable data, right?
And I'm not,
And we haven't done our best to close that data gap for them. And
and
we're
I
asking
actually
them to give
think,
us information to close our data gap too, right?
We're asking them to make plans without the rule book and the priorities.
Right, without the
And-
direction, right?
Without the direction
And
in
to-
a lot of
to-
ways. And so in the absence of that, they're left with, well, we probably shouldn't ask for anything.
Right, and so
And
we
they
don't
come
know
in
if
and
it's
say,
right.
we're
To your
good with
you know,
that, in the absence of that, rather than saying, going through this process and saying, okay, looking at that in that 10 or 15 year interim, what are your needs truly in that time, and now how do we plan for that?
and please don't take that as anyone sitting around this table or anyone on staff that I'm upset with them specifically. What I'm upset with, I'm upset with the fact that this is an issue that we've been known about for a long time, and I appreciate the fact that we're finally getting through it. Because it got to the point where there was so much contention in this body that staff did not, that certain members of staff that are no longer with us just kind of gave up and just stopped trying and kind of went around council a lot. And the fact that we are going through this process now, I think is a very big positive, and I think it sets us up for success long term. So it's appreciated.
You asked a little bit about maybe some of our frustrations or things like that, and I read a comment the other day that kind of saddened me really in relationships, that it said that our city staff operate in fear. And I was like, operate in fear? Why is our city staff operating in fear of the council and our direction of people? It's crazy. I guess the assumptions that you talked about, that they might be assuming something, we might be assuming something. I guess it's really important for, just only speaking for myself, for people to understand, if I'm irritated about assumption or baffled by assumption, it's not ever directed at a person. It's always just baffled at the assumption or things like that. So I think it's so important to convey that we are a team. And sometimes, my husband and I are a team, and sometimes I get baffled by his assumptions, right? But that doesn't mean I think less of him, the same staff. It's not because I think less of them or anything, it's just somehow we're not on the same communication thing. So I appreciate this. I think it will bring us to that point where we're much more informed on both sides. But I would hope that we can all make decisions based on that assumption that we're just all trying to do a good job, and it has nothing personal to do with anyone that's making those assumptions. It's just simply that they're different mind frame, different people. So I would hope that it's not the case, and if it is the case, these types of things address that.
No matter what this situation is, there's the data, and there's always a subjective part to it, right? There's always how it's interpreted.
Right.
And then the decision making that comes from those two things, right? And sometimes that gets muddy, and that's for me, the moderator, right? To figure out what the board is saying, right? And put it in a digestible form for those that need to get it done, and then that's his job again to bring that information together and give it back to us, right? And that part has been missing for 9 months, right? Almost a year, really. And so I think this last 12 months, we've all felt that strain and that frustration a little more, because there is that, we've been missing that interpreter, right? There's, who do you go to, right? So that's part of it.
Jacob.
Thanks, Jared, appreciate that.
Ouch! Harsh!
let's face it,
You stepped to that one, Jared.
we gave you a car that was out of alignment, the brakes were
That's
bad.
right.
With no gas.
Your tread was really
We told-
worn on
no,
one
no, no,
tire.
no.
He had no expectations for me,
That's what I was gonna say, to be fair, that's not your job. That's not what we're expecting you to do,
Oh my
right?
gosh.
We're just keep us afloat.
Again,
I don't have
not
any
exactly,
expectations
just
of-
keep the lights on and keep us going. We didn't wanna put her in that position.
I just we wanted you to actually still want to stay at the end of that.
My next point,
I don't know what he's talking about.
we've talked about the growing stages of the city, right, to this point. And I think that that's part of this, what was just talked about, right?
Yeah.
When the city started, yeah, a few people did everything, right? And it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because we have a lot of really good people who take pride in what they do and they take ownership of a lot of things. But that's kind of a bad thing when you're growing and you need to delegate those things to other people and give someone else ownership of that. Sometimes that's difficult to do, right? And if you're not forced to do it, sometimes you don't. And so I think that there's the data element, there's the interpreting it amongst, right? And then there's really just kind of that humanist, natural person, what things do you let go of and how effective are you and how efficient are you? Yeah, sometimes somebody has to help us see that.
Well, that's our, like I said, internally, we're gonna have some of this discussion to figure out what is a realistic approach as a staff to meet some of these demands, cause I think we've, and maybe it was just that lack of leadership, of nobody in city manager and, you know, somebody, I think Wendy did a great job of saying, let's wait. Right, cause you hate to have big decisions made and you get there and say, no, we're gonna change this completely, cause then people feel like whiplash, but,
There's a big pause button.
and I
Keep
do
the status
think,
quo, right? Yeah.
You did a great job.
so we should come out of this, I still feel Harriman is positioned well, right, for the future. We can look at all the assumptions, and I could probably argue 5 different ways how Olympia will either be positive or negative, right? Just depending on which assumption we start with. Take it out, we still have a lot of positives. Now, we may wanna talk about if South Jordan all of a sudden builds Daybreak 2 right on our borders, coming around us, what we think that will be like, cause they won't care what we think. But, so those are those challenges that I see myself, you know, kind of going through the numbers and saying, it'll mean this if I assume this, right? But that's, I tend to think in models and assumptions and if I do one of those tests, I'm very analytical with my staff up here.
You know, one of the things I've seen about this council is that when we're all working off of the same underlying assumptions, we generally have pretty close to consensus among us, right? I mean, I think you get a group of fairly reasonable people together and you understand what the issues are, right or wrong, and we get kind of what the information says, and if we're working from the same assumptions, we generally come to the same conclusions on a lot of things. It's when those assumptions are widely divergent, then we come up with way different points of view, way different answers, right? So I think it's important, at least there's a benefit in to go through the exercise of understanding what the assumptions are, right? These are some of the things I'm believing that's leading me to this position, and work through some of those, right?
I think as staff, we can tell you what we're doing, but if you get to a spot where the consensus say we want different assumptions, then, always feel free. I know councilors, if it's in front of you, you have to make a decision. That decision can be, can you bring this back to us?
Yeah, amen.
Here's a different assumption, run these numbers a little differently, look at this differently and bring it back to us. You may still include all those and you may bring the other one back and say, you know what, that first one makes sense now, I thought about it and see the other one. But council should never feel compelled to make a decision. Now, I will say there are some things the state may have a timeline on or something, so in those instances, it's out of your hands, but 90% of what you're gonna do, if you're not comfortable that day, punt it. I mean, you'll have some developers upset if you're doing certain things, but it's still okay if you're looking at it and saying, I see that you think X is gonna happen, but what if it's A? Well, we didn't think about that, staff, so we'll go back and say, here's
So
what we
their
think would
answer is
happen.
always, oh, that will never happen.
Right.
I've never heard that before.
I mean, there are some, you always make some reasonableness assumptions, like, okay, when we do emergency operations tabletop drills, you have some consultants who will have you do, it's a train crash, okay, you got a train, oh, that's reasonable. That could happen, wildfire, yeah, that could happen, train crash and a wildfire at the same time, well, maybe the train started it, then a plane crash, what? Active shooter.
It's carrying tubes of
apocalypse,
Ebola.
Yeah, it's a chlorine gas cloud, and
There's
you have
no
an active
train
shooter, and
anywhere
at some
in
point
the
you just
city.
put your hands up and say, okay, could those things all happen at the same time?
During a
Yes.
global pandemic.
During a global pandemic, could they happen? Yes. Is
Likelihood,
it likely? No.
Right.
It's so infinitesimally small, we shouldn't train for it, but, so, there will be some reasonableness that we will make as staff, and we'll try to disclose that, and if you ask us, if it's not clear in the staff report, and you wanna know, ask us, we'll tell you what assumptions we made behind that. We'll try and spell that out, but there'll be some things we'll undoubtedly miss in there.
And I would say that based on my experience, I think there is value in having somebody making unreasonable assumptions to challenge you, right? In any group, if everybody's always in agreement, that always gets me a little bit worried, like that nobody has a question, nobody has a challenge. I think there's benefit to that, right?
my kids do that
Oh,
every
yeah,
day.
I agree, yeah.
Unreasonable assumptions. I think that actually is honestly the new kind of clarity phrase for us as a council is okay, what assumptions were you, if we don't know going into it, what assumptions were used in making your recommendation? And I think that will get us all on the same page, so.
Well, and I promised to try and keep you to 2 hours, so I've got like 6 pages of notes, and then one I folded up and stuck in here, and I know Tammy's been typing away. I don't know how many notes, and Chase, others have notes here.
Wendy only has 4 pages, so she would think most of
My writing's so terrible, so I probably
Our
wrote the
stuff
same
wasn't
thing.
just as, he thought it was more important than you did,
She
I
just
understand.
keeps,
She just assumed what I was gonna say was
That's right.
null and void.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a lot here, and I think there's, it'll take a little time to kind of synthesize that. We're meeting tomorrow to start talking a little bit about that internal stuff, but we'll spend some time on this as well. Thinking, how do we start to put that together? I do think, it's time to revisit the vision of the community and that strategic plan. I don't know that you've ever had a true strategic plan, so that may be coming out of
Yeah,
this.
I think not.
But we'll, I've got a lot, and like I said, I wanted to keep you to 2 hours if I could, cause I do
Motion
appreciate you coming on Monday, so. I've got a lot, I'm good, we can end.
I'm serious.
I'll accept the
Wait,
motion.
wait, one quick question.
I won't.
So,
I was ready.
this
He was
service
literally
group
gonna take a
wants to reserve, they want us to reserve Mountain Ridge High School so they can do an event. Riverton is doing it at Riverton High for another part of this group. I just wanna make sure that unintended consequences, we're the ones signing, saying, hey, if school district, we're renting this facility.
Why wouldn't they just,
Yeah, it's a school.
Because, well, it's not the school, it's a private,
well, why wouldn't they?
They're not organized.
they're not, it's not that, it's a bunch of church stakes that are all
It's a
together.
personal liability or something.
Yeah, so
that
it's-
The city isn't,
Indemnified.
Otherwise, they'd have to buy like.
It's probably no more of a risk than some of,
Always.
probably less risk than the motocross event we did.
We got a little sketchy there.
So, but that's the question, they asked us, would the city do this like Harriman, or like Riverton is doing?
Can I add on to that? Today I was asked if the city could sign Alex's contract, his performance contract.
And what is that?
Same kind of reasoning.
Oh, just,
It's just his rider and
Who's paying for it, or is it free?
no funds come, it's no financial.
city's not
Yeah,
gonna
but
get
are we
anything funded.
liable for it?
Chase.
That's what they're
That's
asking
exactly
us-
why-
that's
that's
what
exactly
they're
why you
asking
would
us to
sign.
that's just
I
why they
haven't
want
seen
us
the
to
agreement.
sign.
Yeah.
You're always liable.
It's the insurance.
Which is what they want us as an organization, probably because we have insurance for events. I don't know if we would need a special one, I haven't looked at our insurance.
I
Talk to
would like,
Travis about that.
I would like some more information from our attorneys.
Have you seen that?
He said it was okay.
Ask the insurance,
Alright,
that's what they.
so, that sounded like we gave you some direction, I'm looking for a motion.
Already made.
Okay,
All in
already
favor?
seconded.
Okay, I was like, come on, guys.
I reached out to Riverton to find out what if they had talked anything, but, David Ricky's out of town.
But still, I was
These guys get charged with